Emily Carter was found dead at the bottom of a ravine, her body still buckled in the driver's seat of her crushed SUV. Her boyfriend, Ryan Morris, said she left early for a weekend at the lake. The police called it a tragic accident. But her father, Richard Carter, saw one detail that didn't fit, and when he asked a single, quiet question, everything began to unravel. Hidden inside Emily's final days was a secret worth killing for, a corporate lie buried beneath a staged crash, and a truth no one expected to survive her. Emily Carter's silver SUV was discovered crushed against a tree at the bottom of a steep ravine just off Crestline Highway, a road infamous for its sudden turns and poor visibility. The sun had barely risen when a hiker noticed a broken guardrail and followed the trail of twisted metal and debris down the embankment. The emergency call came in at 7:42 a.m., and within minutes, local paramedics, fire crews, and a sheriff's deputy were on site. What they found looked like a clear-cut case of a fatal accident. Emily, just 27, had suffered massive trauma to her head and chest. Her seatbelt was still fastened, the airbag deployed, and the interior of the car smelled of gasoline and pine. The road she crashed on was notorious for being dangerous in poor weather, and that morning, a thick fog blanketed the area. Investigators quickly concluded that visibility, speed, and possibly a distraction caused Emily to veer off the road. Her vehicle's tires had hit a patch of loose gravel, slid across the shoulder, and flown through the guardrail. The accident report was filed within a day, and the official statement was simple. Emily Carter died in a tragic single-vehicle accident. News of her death hit Windermere like a storm. Emily had grown up there, the daughter of retired engineer Richard Carter and schoolteacher Lynn Carter. She was well-liked, bright, organized, never the kind to take unnecessary risks. She had graduated top of her class, earned a degree in pharmaceutical sciences, and worked at a respected regional medical firm in the city. Everyone remembered her as responsible, always smiling, and deeply devoted to her work. Her boyfriend, of 2 years, Ryan Morris, spoke to local reporters and recalled how she had planned to visit her family's lake cabin that morning to clear her mind and relax after a stressful project. He had kissed her goodbye at 6:30 a.m. and watched her drive away into the mist. The community rallied behind the Carter family. Flowers and condolence notes poured into their home. A candlelight vigil was held outside the church where Emily had been baptized. The town mourned the loss of someone they believed had a promising future. Yet, amid all the sorrow and the sympathy, one person couldn't accept the explanation. Her father, Richard Carter, had worked on countless accident sites during his time. As a structural engineer, he'd examined twisted steel and fallen bridges. He'd pored over forensic reports, and he knew how to read mechanical damage. When he saw the photos of Emily's wreck, something gnawed at him. Her car, a model with advanced safety features, had its front end crushed, but the rear was nearly untouched. The vehicle had landed nose first, and yet the autopsy listed injuries to the back of her head. Richard asked about the discrepancy, but the coroner dismissed it as secondary injuries from the tumbling motion of the crash. Still, Richard's instincts didn't let him rest. Emily was a meticulous driver. She never sped, always kept her car in perfect shape, and avoided mountain roads in foggy weather. The idea that she simply lost control didn't sit right with him. He requested the accident scene photos, examined weather reports, and studied traffic camera timestamps. Nothing jumped out until he made a visit to the impound lot where Emily's SUV was stored. That it was there he noticed the dashboard phone mount, empty. Emily never drove without her phone in it. She used it for navigation, music, and calls. Yet, her phone wasn't listed among the recovered belongings. The police returned an older model from her bag, one she had stopped using months ago. Her newer phone, the one she always carried, was missing. When Richard asked the officer in charge about it, he received a vague answer. Something about how it may have been lost or destroyed. But he knew better. Phones don't just vanish without a trace, especially when they're inside the cabin during a crash. Emily's phone had been in a hardshell case, and her car's interior was surprisingly intact. So where was it? That question, seemingly small and almost insignificant, planted a seed in Richard's mind. If something as basic as a missing phone didn't make sense, what else didn't? He wasn't ready to accuse anyone or to stir up trouble while his wife was grieving. But he made a silent decision that day, standing alone next to the wrecked car. He would find out what really happened to his daughter, because sometimes the difference between an accident and a crime lies in the details everyone else overlooks. Richard Carter didn't share his doubts right away. In the days after the funeral, he kept his suspicions to himself, knowing the rest of his family was too deep in grief to hear anything that sounded like denial. But his mind couldn't let it go. The missing phone kept playing over and over in his head. Emily wasn't careless. She didn't forget things. She didn't drive recklessly. And she didn't carry around old phones she no longer used. Something was off. 2 weeks after Emily's death, Richard went to the sheriff's department to collect her personal belongings. They handed him a sealed box with her purse, her keys, and a few other small items. Her backpack was included, recovered mostly undamaged from the back seat. Inside were her laptop, a spiral notebook filled with work notes, a travel mug, and that old phone, dead and dusty. As he held it in his hand, Richard could barely believe they had even included it in the report. It was a model she hadn't used in almost 6 months. Why had she brought it with her that day? He charged it as soon as he got home, but the phone was nearly wiped. No recent calls, no messages, just a few old photos and outdated apps. Her real phone, the one she'd been using every day, was nowhere in the box, and there was no mention of it in the official documentation. Richard called the sheriff's office to clarify, but he received the same vague explanation. It probably got thrown from the vehicle during the crash. It happens sometimes. But Richard didn't believe it. The crash hadn't been violent enough to fling things far from the car, especially not with all the windows still intact. Her backpack had been recovered neatly tucked behind the passenger seat. If the phone had been in its usual dashboard cradle, it would have likely ended up nearby or still attached. But there was nothing. Richard decided he needed help from someone with more experience in digging beyond the surface. He reached out to Dana Caldwell, a retired state trooper turned private investigator known for her work on cold cases and unusual deaths. Dana had a reputation for thoroughness, and more importantly, she believed in instinct, especially when a parent says something doesn't feel right. Dana began by requesting the car's onboard diagnostics and crash data. Most modern vehicles, including Emily's SUV, store vital information in an internal recorder, sometimes called the black box. The data revealed something unexpected. Seconds before the crash, both the driver's and passenger's seatbelts had been fastened. But then, mid-impact, the driver's belt showed signs of being released, and the passenger airbag had deployed. A strange inconsistency, since investigators had said Emily was alone. The airbag deploying from the passenger's side meant there had to be weight in that seat at the time of the crash. Enough weight to trigger the sensor, likely another person. But no one else had been found at the scene. If someone else had been with her, where did they go? Why weren't there any footprints or secondary evidence of someone fleeing? Dana pulled security footage from nearby traffic cameras, piecing together Emily's last known movements. Early that morning, she had been spotted at a local coffee shop near her apartment. The timestamp was 5:57 a.m., more than 30 minutes before Ryan claimed she had left home. She wasn't alone. The footage showed her standing in line, arms crossed tightly, looking over her shoulder frequently. She seemed nervous. Next to her stood a tall man in a black hoodie with the hood pulled up. He kept his face turned away from the cameras. They didn't appear to speak much, but they left the shop together. The next image caught her car driving through a toll point on the mountain highway. An hour later, with only one visible occupant. But the timestamp didn't line up with Ryan's account. He said she left the house at 6:30 a.m., but the toll booth image was taken at 7:19 a.m. That meant someone else had possibly driven her car at a different time than she was expected to be on the road. Dana also noticed that in the video, the driver of the SUV wore a hat, something Emily rarely did. Even more disturbing was that the coffee shop security camera showed her leaving without her car. She had walked away from the parking lot with the man. Her vehicle wasn't seen in the footage at all. So how did it end up an hour away on a mountain road she had never liked to drive alone? The deeper Dana dug, the stranger things became. Emily's bank records showed an odd transfer, $10,000 sent to a small account in the name of Beacon Solutions. The company had no website, no phone number, and no listed address. When Dana ran it through a corporate registry, she found it was registered under one name, Benjamin Knox. Knox wasn't a friend or colleague. He had a background in private security, had once been charged with aggravated assault, and now appeared connected to Emily in the days before her death. What kind of relationship did they have, and why would Emily send him that much money? As Richard stared at the rapidly thickening file, he realized the missing phone wasn't the only anomaly. There was a trail forming, a pattern that pointed away from a simple car accident. Emily hadn't just died by misjudging a curve in the road. She had died under circumstances that were beginning to look more and more deliberate. And somewhere, in those last hours, someone else had been with her. Dana Caldwell's investigation began turning up more questions than answers, but none more pressing than this. What happened in the missing hours between the coffee shop footage and the crash? Emily had left her apartment early, been seen with a stranger, and then somehow ended up alone in her vehicle on a road she avoided. The timeline had gaps, and Dana was determined to fill them. She began by contacting the toll agency to retrieve every available frame from the booth Emily's SUV passed through. Though the cameras were grainy, she was able to confirm something troubling. The driver wore dark clothing and appeared taller and broader than Emily. The face wasn't visible, but the body posture, build, and movements didn't match the young woman's. The SUV continued past the toll, disappearing toward the cliffs, where it would eventually be found wrecked at the bottom of the ravine. That it became increasingly clear to Dana that Emily hadn't been behind the wheel. But that meant someone else was, and that person had vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, Richard Carter was digging through Emily's personal files on her laptop. She'd used encryption on several folders, which was unlike her unless the contents were sensitive. With Dana's help, they decrypted the files and uncovered a series of documents related not to her personal life, but her job at Foresight Medical. What they found was deeply unsettling. Emily had assembled an extensive collection of internal emails, test results, and confidential reports. She had flagged multiple instances of clinical trial data being altered or falsified. Some test subjects had reported severe side effects from a new drug under development, yet those entries had been scrubbed clean in the final documentation. Emily had been compiling a case, quietly, methodically, perhaps preparing to go public. There was one name that appeared multiple times in the emails: Leah Ortiz. A quick search revealed that Leah was an independent investigative journalist who specialized in whistleblower reports and corporate fraud. Dana reached out to her, expecting stonewalling. Instead, Leah responded quickly. She'd been waiting for someone to contact her about Emily. Leah confirmed that Emily had contacted her months ago with concerns about unethical practices at Foresight. She had sent Leah heavily redacted documents as a preview, promising the full set later. They had spoken several times using encrypted messaging apps. Emily was cautious, saying she didn't trust her employer or even her own apartment. Leah said Emily had grown increasingly paranoid in the final days before her death, and then suddenly stopped all communication. Leah had never received the full files. The last message Emily sent simply read, "He knows. I think I'm being followed. Transferring now." That was the night before her crash. The transfer Emily mentioned aligned with the $10,000 payment Richard and Dana had found earlier, sent to the shell company linked to Benjamin Knox. Knox, it seemed, had been hired by Emily to physically deliver the hard drive containing the incriminating evidence to Leah. But Leah never received it. So where did it go? Dana tracked Knox's known associates and addresses, but he had gone underground. No recent banking activity. No digital trail. It was as if he had disappeared. That is, until a surveillance camera from a rural gas station captured a man matching his description getting into a rented truck the day after Emily's crash. He had no luggage, just a small black duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Authorities issued a warrant for his arrest, and 2 weeks later, he was picked up in a motel room in a remote Nevada town. When brought in for questioning, Knox admitted to knowing Emily. He claimed she had hired him to protect her and deliver sensitive information to a journalist, but he denied any involvement in her death. He told investigators she was already dead when he returned to the car after stepping away briefly to make a call. According to him, panic took over. He staged the crash to look like an accident and fled. It sounded ridiculous. Why would he leave the body in the car and risk being traced through traffic cameras? Why not just disappear without taking the time to stage a wreck? Knox stuck to his story. But one detail he gave caught Dana's attention. He claimed the man who had been threatening Emily wasn't just anyone. He was someone inside the company, someone high up. Knox said Emily had confided in him about a senior executive who had warned her once before to drop it and walk away. When Dana asked who that person was, Knox only said one thing: check the flights. He left the country right after she died. Back at her desk, Dana ran international travel logs and found something unusual. Arthur Langley, the CEO of Foresight Medical, had flown to Geneva the morning after Emily's death on a private jet. It wasn't part of a scheduled trip. No meetings were booked. No press was notified. And he hadn't returned. The pieces were starting to fit together. Emily had discovered something massive. She had tried to expose it. She feared for her life. She tried to escape. And someone made sure she wouldn't succeed. What had once looked like a random crash was now the center of a much larger story, one involving fraud, cover-ups, and a deadly silence. And it wasn't over yet, while Benjamin Knox sat in a holding cell, refusing to say anything further. Dana Caldwell and Richard Carter pressed forward with the most urgent question yet. What was the CEO of Foresight Medical trying to hide, and how far would he go to protect it? The hard drive Emily had allegedly given to Knox was still missing. The files on her laptop were thorough but incomplete, and without the full contents, any legal action would be difficult. The death alone wasn't enough to bring down a corporate giant. They needed irrefutable proof. Dana focused her search on Langley's movements. His private jet had landed in Geneva, but within hours he had taken another flight to a small island in the Mediterranean, where he owned a luxury villa under a different holding company. It was clear he had no intention of returning soon. That sudden disappearance the day after Emily's crash was more than suspicious. It was strategic. Meanwhile, Richard found himself reviewing every one of Emily's old journals, calendars, and voice memos. In one of them, he came across a recording, buried in a subfolder on her laptop. Emily spoke calmly, almost clinically, outlining the falsification of trial data for a new drug Foresight plan to release under expedited approval. The voice note named not only Langley, but also 2 other executives. She mentioned plans to meet someone who could help her secure the delivery of the data. That had to be Knox. Dana had an idea. If Knox wasn't talking and the hard drive was missing, maybe there was a digital backup. She revisited Emily's email metadata, focusing on timestamps and attachments. One entry, dated 2 nights before her death, showed a large file sent to an encrypted cloud drive. The email itself had been deleted, but the remnants remained. With some effort and a few legal maneuvers, Dana obtained access to the cloud drive. And there it was, a folder titled Project Orion. Inside were hundreds of documents, spreadsheets, and scans of signed internal memos. It confirmed every claim Emily had hinted at. Foresight Medical had knowingly released early versions of the drug for trial use despite serious complications during animal testing. Several human test subjects had suffered irreversible neurological damage. Reports had been altered, signed off, and sealed. It was a massive cover-up, all to ensure a fast-track drug approval that would bring the company billions. Leah Ortiz, the journalist, reviewed the data and confirmed its authenticity. With the files in hand and her legal team ready, she prepared to go public. But before she could, Dana advised her to sit tight. There was still one piece missing. Why was Emily killed, and how was it arranged? Dana circled back to Knox's bank account. He had received not just the $10,000 from Emily, but another payment days after the crash. This one was much larger, wired from a shell company that traced back to a Foresight subcontractor. The message was clear. Someone had paid him not just to retrieve the data, but to make sure Emily never lived to share it. Knox had claimed he only found her already dead, but that narrative fell apart under forensic review. A second autopsy, pushed through quietly by Dana and Richard, revealed that Emily had suffered blunt force trauma inconsistent with a car crash. Her injuries were inflicted before the vehicle went over the edge. She had likely been unconscious, or already dead before impact. The seatbelt had been buckled after death. It wasn't just a staging. It was a setup, deliberate and calculated. With the autopsy results, the forensic financial trail, and the internal company files, federal authorities finally launched a full investigation. They raided Foresight Medical's headquarters, seizing hard drives and email servers. Several high-level employees were detained. Langley's name was added to an international watch list. Public outrage followed. News outlets picked up the story. Leah Ortiz released a detailed exposé, crediting Emily Carter as the whistleblower who had tried to speak up and paid with her life. Knox, now facing charges of conspiracy and second-degree murder, finally broke. He admitted that Langley had ordered the job through a third party. Emily was to be scared, silenced, and if necessary, eliminated. Knox insisted he hadn't meant for it to go that far. But by the time he returned to the cabin to pick her up, she had threatened to expose everything. And he panicked. He had struck her, not expecting the blow to be fatal. When she collapsed, he decided to make it look like an accident. He drove the car, buckled her in, and pushed it off the cliff. Then he walked 5 miles to the nearest road and disappeared. His confession was chilling, but it confirmed what Richard had feared all along. Emily hadn't died by chance. She had been murdered for trying to do the right thing. And all it had taken to uncover the truth was one question, asked by a father who refused to believe the story he was given. The public fallout was immediate. Within hours of the federal raids, at Foresight Medical's headquarters, news outlets were broadcasting the story nationwide. A young research analyst, Emily Carter, had uncovered a dangerous pharmaceutical cover-up and had been silenced before she could speak out. Pictures of Emily in her lab coat, her bright smile and determined eyes, flashed across television screens and filled social media feeds. What had begun as a quiet local tragedy now became a symbol of corporate corruption and the cost of conscience. Protests erupted outside the company's offices. Investors pulled out. Stock prices collapsed. Foresight Medical, once a rising star in the biotech world, was reduced to chaos. More arrests followed as investigators uncovered emails and text messages confirming the cover-up. High-ranking executives were indicted for fraud, obstruction of justice, and criminal negligence. Test patients and their families began filing lawsuits. Regulators who had looked the other way were now under scrutiny. But for Richard Carter, no amount of exposure or legal accountability could undo what had been done. His daughter was still gone. Emily's mother, Lynn, struggled to face the media storm that surrounded their family now. Reporters called day and night, their house surrounded by vans and cameras. The quiet grief they had expected to carry in private had become a very public affair. Yet amid the whirlwind, Richard felt something else: resolve. He hadn't let Emily's death be buried under excuses and paperwork. He had asked the question that changed everything. Why was her phone missing? That single inconsistency had led to the unraveling of an entire criminal enterprise. And now, with the investigation complete, the trial loomed. Benjamin Knox took a plea deal in exchange for full testimony against Arthur Langley and two of his executive team. His statement confirmed the worst. Emily had tried to deliver the evidence discreetly. She had feared surveillance and retaliation. The plan had been to meet Knox, hand over a hard drive, and disappear for a few days to stay safe. But somewhere along the way, Langley learned of her plan. Knox had been instructed to scare her off and retrieve the data. Instead, it had ended in violence. The night before the crash, Knox lured Emily out of her apartment under the pretense of moving her to a secure location. They stopped at a coffee shop, then drove toward the mountains. At some point, Emily realized something was wrong. She argued. She tried to take her phone and call for help. Knox, fearing exposure and betrayal, hit her. Whether the blow was meant to silence or kill was unclear, but by the time he stopped, she was unresponsive. He panicked. Rather than leave her body behind, he staged the crash to look like a solo accident. He removed her phone, knowing it would contain messages to the journalist and GPS data. Then, he walked away that Emily's final hours were pieced together through digital forensics, camera footage, and Knox's confession. Her attempt to save others had cost her everything. But she had left enough behind to expose the truth: Arthur Langley was extradited from Europe and brought back to stand trial. The courtroom was packed for his first appearance. As he was led in wearing handcuffs, Richard sat in the front row, holding his daughter's favorite scarf. Langley showed no emotion as the charges were read: conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud, and multiple counts of manslaughter. His empire had crumbled. The trial stretched on for months. Dana Caldwell testified about her investigation. Leo Ortiz took the stand to describe Emily's courage and fear in those final days. Medical experts confirmed the damage the unreleased drug had caused to test patients. Family after family spoke of lost loved ones, irreversible harm, and lies. They had been told, in the end, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Langley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That a memorial fund was established in Emily's name to support whistleblowers in scientific and medical fields. Her story became a case study in ethics courses across the country. A mural of her, painted on the side of her old university's research building, bore the words, "Truth doesn't die in silence." Still, for Richard, the legacy was personal. He often visited the lake cabin where Emily had planned to spend that last weekend. It was quiet there, a place she had loved since childhood. On the porch sat the rocking chair she used to read in. Untouched since her last visit, he would sit in that chair sometimes, alone, not to grieve but to remember. Not the ending, but the strength. The fire in her that refused to let wrongs go unchallenged. He remembered every word the sheriff had said at the beginning, that it was just a tragic accident, that these things happen. But he had looked at that empty dashboard mount and asked the question that changed it all. Why was her phone missing? It had been the start of the unraveling, the first thread pulled from a tangled web. And now, because of that question, the truth had found its way to the surface. Emily Carter had died fighting for something that mattered. And in the end, she won.